As part of the process, you may want to create a report. The purpose of this would be to update the team who normally processes the transactions to let them know whether each of the cases has either been successful or failed. This will allow them either to rework them or give them the confidence that the work they would have normally done has been processed successfully. Let's quickly create a component that we can eventually plug into our framework later on. Let's use our component template and copy it into the generic folder. Let's call this generic create report. And in UiPath, let's open it up and have a look. Let's update the component name. And let's check the arguments that are coming in. In this report, the information we're going to need is firstly the WID of the case that was processed, and secondly the status of that transaction. So for example, if it was a success or if it was an exception. If it was an exception, we also need the exception reason. So we're going to have a few arguments coming in. We're going to have in WID, in status, in exception reason. We need to make sure that the direction of the arguments is correct. So let's change this to in. We're going to keep the file path argument because that's going to be the location of our report template. Let's update the default value to C temp report template. And let's go and create that Excel file quickly. The file is going to have the WID, it's going to have the status, it's going to have an exception reason if one is provided, and it's also going to have the date processed. Of course, you can add more information to this report as you require, but we're going to add the bare minimum here. Let's save the template and close it. Okay, let's work through our component and make sure that we've got all of the information that we require. First of all, we're checking if the WID is empty, which is a good check. Let's also check to see if our report template file path exists. We don't need to check if we're on a particular screen. Let's also check if the report template file exists. We're checking in file path, and if it's not found, we get an exception message. So that's a good check. So for this particular report, what we want to do is check if a report has already been created for today's date. If it has, then we want to append to an existing report. If it hasn't, then we want to create a new one. So first thing we need to do is to check if the existing report for today exists. What we'll do is create a folder where we'll store all of our daily reports. We'll create that in ctemp and call it daily reports. Next, we'll create a second argument, which will provide the robot with the directory of that daily report folder. We'll call it in daily report folder. And in the default value, we'll pass it the full location of that folder. So let's check, does a file exist in daily report folder? And we want to combine that with the report name, which we haven't yet decided, and today's date. In order to do that, we can use a function called path.combine. This prevents us from having to use the slashes, // and trying to work out when and where they should be included. We'll add an additional argument, which will be the report name. And we'll combine this with today's date. The date and the report name will be separated with an underscore. And to reference today's date, we can use the format system.date time.today.toString, and then the format of the date that we're looking for. So we're going to use year. Pay attention to the capitalization of the letters because that dictates whether you're using minutes, months, days, years. Don't forget that we need to create our in argument in report name. And hopefully you don't have any errors. So What's also a good practice here is because this code is quite complicated, it's quite sensible to log the location that we're looking for. So that when you're debugging, trying to work out whether that file does or doesn't exist, it's quite easy to work out exactly what the robot's looking for. Simply copy the syntax from the path exists statement into the log message. Next up, we'll do a check to see if that exists. If it does exist, we will upload the template. If not, we'll create a new file. So now we're going to either read in that template or create a new one for today's report. Let's take an if statement. We need to make sure that there's an output from the exist property of the path exists. Let's create a Boolean value called bool report exists. And in our if statement, we will check to see whether that report already exists. So from the workbook activities, take read range. The workbook path will be exactly the same as the file that we just checked for. We'll leave the sheet as sheet 1 for the time being, and we want to read in the whole file. We'll change the name to read existing file. And when it's loaded, we'll load it to a data table called DT report. If the file doesn't exist, then rather than create a new file, actually what we'll do is we'll read the template that we created earlier. So let's read range and provide the path of the report template, which is the in-file path. We'll read it to the same table, DT report. Now, regardless of whether the file already exists, we'll have a table held in memory. Next up, we need to append to that table. So to do this, we use the add data row activity. And to add new information, simply update the data table property with the name of our data table, which is DT report. And in the array row, in squiggly brackets, we're going to enter our WID, our status, our exception reason, and the date processed. These are all arguments that we've passed into this particular component. In status, in exception reason. For the date field, we're going to use datetime.now, .toString, and we're going to format it with year, month, date, and then hour, minute, second. Once we've added the data row, what we need to do is re-export the file to the daily report for today. To do this, we use a write range activity. So again, use the system.workbook activity for write range. The workbook path, again, is going to be the same as the daily report folder that we were looking for. And the data table is going to be the DT report table that we've just updated. Don't forget to add headers to the new file that's being exported. Check that the add headers are being included originally when we're reading in either the daily report file from today or the template. And one other thing is we need to make sure that we have the file path extension when we're looking for the file name. So as well as the date, we need to include .xlsx. Now, if you have a log message, make sure that the log message is also updated to reflect any changes you make to the actual file path that you're looking for. Otherwise, that could add quite a lot of confusion. And now that we've updated all the information in this generate report component, let's give it a run and see what happens. Cool. So in this case, we were expecting a WID in and our exception has been thrown, which is great because that's protecting our component from not having the correct information passed in. Of course, we didn't update the default values, so let's update them with some dummy data. We'll set a status of complete, of successful. There's been no exception reason in this case. And our report name is going to be daily report. Just before we run this, I've noticed one thing that isn't quite right with the syntax. So where we're combining the path, rather than using commas, we should have used some plus signs to append the text rather than creating new folders or searching for folders. This is actually a good lesson though, because where we need to make a change, we also need to make a change in the path exists, the log message, and also in the right range at the bottom. A better approach here would be to use an assign and to create a new variable called str final report file. Let's copy the text and make the changes that we need to make initially. So the first comma is right because in daily report folder is a folder, but after that each of these should be appended rather than separated by commas. So we're looking for a report name which is daily report underscore today's date and XLSX with the extension .xlsx in the report folder, daily report folder, which is ctemp daily reports. Okay, we need to make sure that the variable type is string. And now we've created this new variable, we can reference this rather than using that same complicated code each time. Let's remove it. And let's replace all the instances with our new variable. Great. Now I think we're good to go ahead and run this report component. Let's have a look at the output. The output shows that everything was created successfully, so let's have a look at the folder to make sure that it was. Click into the daily reports folder. We can see there's a new file called daily report. It's an XLSX file with today's date. And the information has been added as expected with the WID, status, and the date processed. Next up, we'll add this into our framework and update all of our end users of all the successful or failed transactions for that given day. So now that we've created the report, we want to go and add it into our framework and use the actual values from each transaction. We can see that in the arguments we're currently using test values for the WID and the status, and we want to use the actual values from each transaction. So let's go back into our framework and decide where we're going to add this. The most sensible point is after the transaction has been processed, and if you have a look in the process transaction state, at the very bottom there's a finally section. We're going to add our invoke workflow for the generic create report component in the same section as the invoke set transaction status workflow. Let's take our component, add it in, and let's import the arguments and see what we need to change. At the moment, we currently have in file path as a hard-coded value. It's never good to have hard-coded values anywhere in our project. So what we're going to do is add this to our config file so we can reference it dynamically and change it more easily. Let's copy and paste the value initially. Open up our config file, add a new setting for the location of this file path. Let's call it reports template folder and provide it with the file path of the report template. Click save, close the file. For our in file path, we're going to change this to config, open brackets, give it the name of our report template folder, .toString. So we can easily change that location whenever we need to. The WID is going to be the WID from our transaction item. So transaction item dot specific content dot open bracket WID dot toString. And next we need to determine what the status of our particular case was. We can do this using a very quick if statement because we already have the information provided to us in the exception rules. So let's take an if statement. In order to determine the status of our transaction, first of all we want to check, was there a business rule exception? We want to check for a business rule exception before a system exception because the business rule exception is a type of system exception. Therefore, if we checked for system first, then even if it was a business rule exception, it would still be seen as a generic exception. So if business rule exception is not nothing, we're going to create a new variable called str execution status. Type the text business exception. Else, take another if. Was there a system exception? So system error is not nothing. We'll assign the execution status equal to system exception. Else set str execution status equal to success. So in the arguments below, rather than success text, we're going to pass in str execution status. Next up, we need to determine the exception reason, if there was one. So if there was a business exception, we're going to create a new variable called str exception message. And because the business exception object has some properties, we're able to reference these. So business rule exception dot message. This will give us the message of the exception, and we can do exactly the same for the system error. Str exception message equals the system error dot message. Else, str exception message is going to be blank. We need to make sure that the scope of the str exception message is high enough to be recognized by the additional if statement. We're going to place it into the set transaction status scope. If the case is successful, then the execution status will be blank. And let's make sure that we assign that just in case the value is not updated correctly. Okay, finally update the create report component invoke with our str exception message variable. And in the interest of time, we'll leave the folder hard-coded and the report name hard-coded, but these are also things that you could update in the config file. So next up, we're going to run our process all the way through and check the output of the report that gets created. This time, rather than closing down the Acme system application, let's leave it open and see what happens. Don't forget, we need to make sure that the queue items have been re-added, otherwise nothing will happen. Go to the data load. Make sure you're back on the work items page and run the data load to get the items back into the queue. On the work items page, you might notice that some of the items are actually completed, which means we won't have anything to load to the queue after we've filtered the data. So let's quickly go and reset the data. And then we can go and load our queue items. Now the data's been loaded to the queue, we can run our main workflow. This time, don't worry about logging out of the Acme system. Once we start running the project, we'll see that it closes it automatically. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to speed up some of the processing. And also, if you wanted to reduce the number of items that are getting loaded and therefore processed each time, you could manually go and update the cases to be completed. So now we've run our process. Let's see what the report has. We save the report into ctemp. We can see a file has been created for today's run. But unfortunately, there's only one item that's been loaded to the queue. The reason for this is because I made a mistake, and believe it or not, I do make mistakes. And if we look at the generic create report component, we can see that I haven't updated the file path of the report to reference our previously created str final report file. So let's do that. And that should fix things. Go ahead, make the change and rerun the report, and you'll have all of the work IDs in the report file for today's run. Okay, so now we've made that change, we're going to have to reset the work items, we're going to reload the information to the queue and rerun our process. Okay, so we're just going to reset the test data. The test data has been successfully reset. Next, we're going to navigate back to our work items list, run our data load process. Great, now the data's been loaded, let's run our main workflow again. And hopefully this time all of the work items will display in the daily report. So now, if we go back to our daily report folder for today, open it up, we can see that all of the work items were processed and fortunately all of them were successful.